Salvation does not always arrive in the way we expect. Brad had spent the last 3 winters alone in the cabin he had built with his own hands, in the valley between 2 mountains where the wind cut like a blade and the snow reached waist deep. He was a man who learned to converse with silence and to find companionship in solitude. His calloused hands knew every plank of that modest construction, every crack in the walls that he himself sealed with clay and moss. The December storm arrived earlier than expected. Brad watched through the fogged window as the snow danced in raging swirls, turning the world into a merciless white cloak. The fire in the fireplace crackled low, and he mentally calculated how many logs were left in the pile outside. It would be enough for another week, maybe 2 if it saved. It was then that he heard the muffled sound of hooves in the snow. No one climbed to those heights in the middle of a blizzard. No one in their right mind would venture down those treacherous paths when the sky poured its white fury upon the earth. Brad grabbed the rifle he always kept loaded next to the door and peered through the crack in the ill-fitting boards. A figure hunched over a thin horse emerged from the snow screen like an apparition. The animal walked slowly, each step a fight against the icy wind. The rider seemed more dead than alive, swinging dangerously in the saddle. Brad opened the door and the wind stormed the cabin like a hungry demon. The figure on the horse lifted his head with effort, and he saw a woman's face, pale as snow itself, with lips purple with cold and eyes that shone with a death-defying determination. She slid out of the saddle and collapsed into the snow. Brad ran up to her, the cold biting her bare arms. The woman was conscious but could barely move. When he took her in his arms, he noticed that one of her legs hung at a strange, useless angle. He carried it into the hut and deposited it next to the fire. She trembled violently, her teeth chattering like castanets. Brad brought blankets and started heating water. When she returned with a steaming mug, she watched him with large dark eyes, studying his every move. The woman didn't say a word that first night. She just accepted the hot broth he offered and let herself be enveloped by the thick blankets. Brad dragged his own mattress near the fireplace, giving the bed to the stranger that fate had brought. For 3 days, the storm roared outside like a wounded beast. The woman remained silent, regaining her strength, watching Brad with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. He noticed that she moved with difficulty, dragging her left leg, but there was a dignity in her gestures that impressed him. On the 4th day, the wind finally calmed down. The snow stopped falling and a heavy silence descended over the valley. Brad went out to fetch more firewood and tend to the woman's horse, a hardy animal that had survived the storm with surprising strength. When she returned, she was sitting at the table, her pale hands clasped on the worn wood. For the first time, she spoke. His voice was hoarse from the cold, but there was an iron determination behind the words. She had a proposal for him. The woman explained that she had nowhere to go. Her family had died in the last epidemic that swept through the city of Carson, and she was left with nothing but the horse and clothes she was wearing. She couldn't work like other women because of her crippled leg, and winter was just beginning. Brad listened in silence, stirring the cooling coffee in his crumpled tin mug. She offered a simple deal: marriage by shelter. He would have a companion for the long winter months, someone to cook and take care of the house. She would have a roof over her head and food on the table. Nothing more, nothing less. A practical arrangement for 2 people that life had left adrift. Brad stared at her for a long time. There was something in his eyes that he couldn't decipher, a depth that suggested untold stories, pains kept silent. She was beautiful in a wild way, with dark hair that framed a face with firm features and a mouth that rarely smiled. He thought of the loneliness that had been his companion for so long. He thought of the endless nights when the wind howled between the mountains, and he wondered if he would ever find his bones among the snow. He thought about the practicality of the proposal, the wisdom of 2 castaways helping each other. By late afternoon, with the sun setting behind the snow-capped peaks, Brad accepted the deal. They were married 3 days later, in a simple ceremony conducted by the Reverend McGrath, who would climb the mountain once a month to visit the uncontacted settlers. The old minister did not ask questions about the speed of the decision or about the strangeness that had appeared out of nowhere. In the West, people learned not to question the choices of others. The woman said her name was Sarah. For the first few weeks, they lived as polite strangers sharing the same space. Sarah cooked with astonishing skill, turning Brad's simple supplies into meals that warmed more than his body. She mended her clothes with small, precise stitches, arranged the hut with quiet efficiency. At night, she would lie on the left side of the bed, always facing the wall. Brad respected the invisible space between them, standing on his side as if a line had been drawn down the middle of the mattress. But there were times when he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. Moments when she noticed how her hands trembled slightly when she thought she was alone. How her eyes were lost in the distance, as if they saw ghosts that only she could see. Sarah never talked about her past, and Brad learned not to ask. In the West, a person's past was sacred territory, and only fools or dead crossed those borders without permission. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Winter showed its cruelest face, completely isolating them from the outside world. But inside the cabin, a comfortable routine has set in. Sarah took care of the house with an almost fierce dedication, as if each task was a debt to be paid. Brad began to notice little things about her, how she always checked the windows before going to sleep, making sure they were tightly closed. As she woke up at the slightest noise during the night, her body tense like a spring ready to fire. How she never ate until she was sure he was satisfied. There were scars on her wrists that she kept carefully hidden under her long sleeves. There was a way she moved that suggested someone used to being hurt, to expecting pain from where affection should come. Brad began to feel something he hadn't experienced in a long time, the need to protect someone, not out of obligation or duty, but out of a deep compulsion that was born of recognizing the pain in someone else's eyes. He began to leave small gestures of kindness scattered throughout the routine, an extra blanket when she coughed during the night, firewood already cut and stacked so she didn't have to drag her bad leg through the snow. Your last piece of jerky left discreetly on your plate. Sarah noticed these gestures, but did not comment on them. He only tilted his head slightly, a silent thank you that was worth more than words. As winter wore on, Brad began to notice subtle changes in her. Sarah relaxed enough to sleep a few hours straight without waking up startled. He began humming softly as he cooked, sad melodies that echoed through the cabin like whispered prayers. There was a night when she woke up screaming, lost in some terrible nightmare. Brad found her sitting on the edge of the bed, her body shaken by silent sobs. Without thinking, he approached and gently touched her shoulder. Sarah cringed at first, but then allowed herself to accept the comfort. Brad stayed awake with her until dawn, offering his silent presence as an anchor against the demons that haunted her. It was in that early morning that something changed between them. An invisible wall had fallen, and for the first time since they met, Sarah looked him in the eye without fear. Winter continued its relentless march, but inside the cabin, two lonely hearts began to find in each other something they had long since lost: hope. Spring arrived like a promise, whispered by the wind. Brad observed the first signs of the thaw with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The ice that covered the stream next to the hut began to crack, producing dry sounds that echoed through the valley like bones breaking. Sarah spent more time on the porch, gazing at the mountains with an expression he couldn't interpret. There was something different about her in the last few weeks. A restlessness that made her constantly check the horizon, as if she hoped to see something or someone emerge from the trails that led to the valley. His hands, once firm and decisive, began to tremble again during the simplest tasks. Brad noticed that she had started hiding little things around the cabin, pieces of dried meat wrapped in cloth, a kitchen knife that disappeared from the drawer, a few coins he kept in a clay pot. When subtly questioned, Sarah just looked away and changed the subject. One morning he woke up to find her standing by the window, still wearing her nightgown, watching the trail that wound down the mountain. Her shoulders were tense, and she bit her lower lip, a habit Brad learned to associate with moments of great anxiety. She hadn't realized he was awake. Brad watched her in silence, noticing how her hands closed and opened repeatedly, as if preparing to hold something, or to fight. There was an energy contained in her, like a wild animal ready to flee at the first sign of danger. When Sarah finally turned around and saw that he was awake, she forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She whispered something about checking if the snow was melting enough to plant, but Brad knew that wasn't what kept her up before dawn. The following days brought more signs that winter was losing its strength. Small streams began to spring up from the hillsides, carrying the melting snow in a watery symphony that filled the silence of the valley. Sarah started to leave the cabin more often, always leaning on a stick that Brad had carved to help her with her crippled leg. She said she was picking the first herbs of spring, but Brad noticed that she always came back empty-handed, her eyes red as if she had cried out of his sight. There was a farewell in his gestures, a way of touching things as if he were seeing them for the last time. One afternoon, While Brad was repairing the fence that had been damaged by the winter, he heard the sound of hooves approaching. His heart twitched as he saw Sarah instantly harden, the color fleeing from her face like water trickling down from the sand. A tall man, mounted on a black horse, slowly climbed the trail. Even from a distance, Brad could see that he was someone accustomed to violence. The subject moved with the predatory confidence of a wolf, and there was something about his posture that made the air feel heavier. Sarah retreated into the cabin without saying a word. Brad followed her and found her leaning against the wall, her eyes closed, breathing like someone who had just run a long distance. His hands trembled uncontrollably. The visitor stopped his horse at a respectful distance from the hut, but did not dismount. It was a middle-aged man with grey hair and a scar that cut his face from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. His eyes were small and hard as river stones. He shouted Sarah's name, but not the name she had given Brad. He shouted Eleanor in a harsh voice that carried both authority and threat. The sound echoed through the valley like a gunshot. Brad looked at Sarah, or Elena, and saw that she had turned into a statue of fear. All the strength he had built up during the winter months seemed to drain away at once, leaving only a terrified woman who was cowering against the wall. The man kept screaming, promising that he had found her trail, that he had followed every clue, that he had finally cornered her. His voice carried an unhealthy possessiveness that made Brad's stomach turn. Through the cracks in the door, Brad could see that the guy was armed, not only with a revolver in his waistband, but with a rifle through the saddle and a hunting knife strapped to his thigh. There was dried blood on his boots, too recent to be from hunting. Sarah, Elena, finally opened her eyes and looked at Brad with an expression of apology so deep that it broke something inside him. She whispered that it was her husband she had left behind, a man who kept her as property, who beat her when she drank, and who had sworn to kill her if she tried to escape. Brad felt a cold fury rise through his chest. It wasn't just anger at what this man had done to Sarah, but at the lie she was forced to live, the need to hide her own identity to survive. The visitor began to grow impatient. He shouted that he knew she was inside, that he could smell her like a bloodhound. He threatened to burn the hut down if she did not leave of her own free will. Brad made a decision that would change everything. He took his rifle and checked if it was loaded. Sarah held his arm, shaking her head desperately, whispering that he didn't understand how dangerous this man was, how many people he had already killed. But Brad saw something in her eyes that she herself didn't realize. For the first time in a long time, there was hope mixed with fear. He opened the door and went out to face the demon that had chased his wife through the winter. The confrontation began with words, but Brad knew it would end with blood. The visitor introduced himself as Jake Morrison, said he had married Elena 3 years ago, and that he had every legal right to take her back. He talked about ownership and obedience, as if Sarah were cattle to be claimed. Brad calmly informed him that Sarah had married him in the winter, and that she was now a free woman. Morrison laughed, a humorless sound that echoed through the mountains like the cry of a vulture. What happened next unfolded in seconds that seemed like hours. Morrison dismounted from his horse with the confidence of someone who had never lost a dispute. His hands moved to the guns with a speed that spoke of years of practice, but Brad had grown up in these mountains, where survival depended on quick reflexes and accurate aim. The echo of the gunshot was lost among the snowy peaks, followed by a silence that seemed to suck in all the sound of the world. Morrison was on the ground, staring up at the sky with an expression of surprise, as if he couldn't believe his story had come to an end in a lost valley in the middle of the mountains. The blood slowly spread across the melting snow, dyeing the earth a color Brad knew he would never forget. Sarah walked out of the cabin slowly, leaning on her pole. She looked at the body of the man who had tormented her for so long, and Brad saw something die in his eyes. Not sadness, but the last vestige of the fear he had carried like a chain. They buried Morrison in a shallow grave on the mountainside, far enough away from the hut that his presence would not contaminate the place where they had found peace. Sarah threw the first handful of dirt over her body, a final gesture of farewell to the part of his life he had controlled. That night, for the first time since they met, Sarah slept soundly without nightmares, without waking up startled. Brad stayed awake watching his relaxed face in the firelight, realizing that he had regained something he thought was lost forever, the ability to protect someone he loved. Because at some point during those winter months, without realizing when or how, Brad had fallen in love with the mysterious woman that fate had brought to his doorstep. And from what she had seen in his eyes when she looked at him after the confrontation, perhaps she too had found something precious in that valley lost among the mountains. Freedom has a weight that not everyone is prepared to carry. Sarah woke up 3 days after the funeral with a twinkle in her eye that Brad had never seen before. It was as if someone had lit a candle inside a lantern that had long been extinguished. She moved around the hut with a different lightness, no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer bouncing with every unexpected noise. For the first time since arriving in the valley, Sarah laughed. The sound echoed through the wooden walls like forgotten music, and Brad felt something warm in his chest as he heard it. It was a genuine, unforced laugh that completely transformed his face and revealed the woman Morrison had tried to destroy. But freedom brought with it questions that Sarah didn't know how to answer. During the winter months, their existence had been defined by the need to survive and hide. Now, with the danger eliminated, she found herself faced with choices she hadn't had to make in a long time. Brad noticed the change immediately. Sarah began to question small things that she had previously accepted without thinking. Why did they sleep on separate sides of the bed when they had shared so much together? Why did they maintain careful politeness when their hearts had drawn near during the long winter nights? One morning, while preparing coffee, Sarah stopped in the middle of the task and looked at Brad with an expression of childlike curiosity. She asked if he really wanted her to stay, now that she no longer needed protection. The question came out hesitantly, as if she feared the answer. Brad stopped tying his boots and stared at her for a long moment. I saw in her eyes the insecurity of someone who spent her life being treated as a burden, as something to be tolerated in exchange for services rendered. The idea that anyone could desire her simply for who she was seemed too strange a concept to believe. He approached slowly, as he would an injured animal, and gently touched her face. Sarah didn't walk away. For the first time, she leaned into the touch, closing her eyes like a flower turning to the sun. Brad said he wanted her there not out of necessity, but out of choice. She said she had fallen in love with the way she hummed as she cooked, the fierce determination she showed even when the pain in her leg made her stumble, the quiet strength that kept her on her feet when the world seemed to collapse around her. Sarah opened her eyes, and he saw tears forming, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of relief, from someone who had finally found a place where he could let his guard down completely. That night, for the first time since they met, they truly slept together, not only sharing the same space, but intertwined like two people who had chosen to meet in the midst of the vastness of their solitudes. The days that followed brought an intimacy that neither of them had experienced before. Sarah began to talk about her real past, not just about Morrison, but about the life she had before him. She talked about a childhood on a farm in Texas, about parents who loved her unconditionally, about dreams she had of teaching children in a small-town school. Brad discovered that Sarah's leg was not crippled from birth, as he had assumed. Morrison had injured her during one of his violent rampages, breaking bones that never healed properly because he refused to allow her to see a doctor. The revelation filled Brad with a retrospective rage that he had to swallow, because Morrison had already paid for his crimes. Sarah, in turn, learned about the solitary life Brad had built in the mountains. He discovered that he was not just a hermit fleeing civilization, but a man who had lost his family in a fire when he was young and could never find a reason to come down from the mountains. They began to plan for the future together. Sarah suggested expanding the small vegetable garden behind the hut, perhaps getting some chickens for the eggs. Brad talked about building an annex to the cabin, creating a larger space for when the winter storms would isolate them again. There was a simple joy in these plans that neither had experienced in years. The feeling that tomorrow was something to be anticipated, not just survived, but the past rarely frees its victims without a final struggle. One afternoon, while Sarah was watering the seedlings they had planted, a second rider appeared on the trail. This time she didn't run into the hut. She stayed where she was, leaning on her rod, watching the visitor approach with a calm that surprised even herself. The man who dismounted did not seem dangerous. He was older, with white hair and the gentle hands of someone who worked his whole life with tools, not weapons. He introduced himself as Walter Morrison, Jake's younger brother. Walter had come to look for his brother, who had disappeared weeks ago following the trail of his runaway wife. He spoke in a tired voice about how he had tried to convince Jake to let Elena go, about how he knew the marriage had become a prison for her. Sarah and Brad exchanged silent glances. Walter seemed genuinely worried, not threatening. There was a kindness in his eyes that contrasted sharply with the cruelty Brad had seen in Jake's eyes. Sarah made a decision that surprised her. He told Walter what had happened. She didn't lie or omit details. She just narrated the facts with an honesty that showed how much she had changed since that winter morning when she arrived almost dead of cold. Walter listened in silence, shaking his head sadly as she described the years of abuse. When Sarah finished, he sighed deeply and said that he had feared that something like this would eventually happen. Jake had always been violent, even as a child, and Walter knew that one day his fury would lead to his destruction. The older brother asked to see the grave. Brad led him to the hillside where they had buried Jake, and Walter stood there for a long time in silence. Finally, he said that Jake had chosen his own destiny and that he was happy that Sarah had found someone who treated her with the dignity she deserved. Before leaving, Walter left a small trunk with Sarah. He explained that it contained some things that had belonged to their mother, simple jewelry, and family letters that Jake had taken when he married Elena. He said he thought it was fair that she kept them as a form of compensation for the stolen years. Sarah opened the trunk after Walter left and found a simple pearl necklace, some gold rings, and a stack of yellowed letters. But what touched her most was a small hand mirror with a carved silver handle. It was the first time in years that she could look at her own reflection without fear. That night, Sarah wore the pearl necklace during dinner, not because jewelry mattered to her, but because for the first time in her adult life, she could wear something beautiful without fearing that someone would hurt her for it. Brad watched her by candlelight, seeing how the pearls enhanced the color of her skin, how her eyes shone with growing confidence. He realized that he was witnessing a rare transformation, a person remembering who he really was after years of being forced to be someone else. Sarah took his hand across the table and squeezed it gently. She said that for the first time since she was a little girl, she felt truly at home, not just because of the place, but because of the person they chose to share it with. Brad intertwined his fingers with hers and knew that he had found something more precious than all the gold hidden in the mountains, a companion who chose to love him not out of necessity or convenience, but for the simple reason that their hearts had recognized in each other something worth protecting. Summer was just around the corner, bringing with it the promise of longer days and starry nights. For the first time in their lives, both Sarah and Brad had reason to look forward to the future. Some stories end where they should have begun. Summer brought to the valley an abundance that Brad had never experienced alone. The garden Sarah planted flourished beyond her most optimistic expectations, filling the table with fresh vegetables and herbs. The chickens she got from a farmer in the neighboring valley laid eggs regularly, and Sarah had learned how to make a loaf of bread that filled the cabin with the aroma of home. But the biggest change was not in material prosperity, but in the way Sarah moved through the world. The woman who had arrived broken by winter now walked with purpose, even with the supporting pole. Her leg would never heal completely, but she had learned to see the scar not as a mark of shame but as proof of her survival. Brad watched these transformations with quiet admiration. Sarah had begun teaching the children of the valley to read, finally fulfilling the dream Morrison had crushed years earlier. 3 times a week, small groups of boys and girls walked up the trail to the hut, carrying slates and chalk, looking forward to the lessons it offered with infinite patience. Seeing Sarah with the children awakened in Brad feelings that he didn't know still existed within him. There was a softness in his voice when he explained the letters, a light in his eyes when a student finally managed to form a word. She had found not only love, but purpose. One morning in August, while Sarah was preparing the day's lessons, Brad made a decision that had been maturing in his heart for weeks. He left the cabin before dawn and rode to the nearest town, a full-day journey he rarely made. He returned at dusk, carrying a small package and the widest smile Sarah had ever seen on his face. Inside the package was a simple gold ring, not ornate or expensive, but chosen with the care of a man who had finally found someone worth sacrificing for. Brad knelt before Sarah not out of tradition, but because he wanted to be at her eye level when she asked the most important question of her life. He asked if she wanted to marry him again, this time not out of necessity or convenience, but out of love. Sarah held Brad's face in her hands and said yes before he even finished speaking. There were tears in his eyes, but they were tears of pure joy, the kind that comes when one realizes that fairy tales can happen even to those who believed they were beyond redemption. They married a second time in September, when the leaves began to change color and paint the mountains with shades of gold and red. This time, It was not a ceremony of convenience conducted by a minister who asked no questions. It was a celebration that the whole valley attended, a feast that lasted until the stars appeared in the sky. Sarah wore the simple cotton dress she had sewn with her own hands, embellished only with the pearl necklace that Walter had returned. Brad put on her best shirt, the one she had so carefully patched up over the winter. They didn't need luxuries to feel like royalty. The children Sarah taught sang a song they had learned especially for the occasion. Neighbors brought food and music, turning the small ceremony into a celebration of life and hope that echoed through the mountains late into the night. When they were finally alone, Sarah and Brad sat on the balcony of the cabin, watching the last embers of the campfire that had warmed the guests. Sarah rested her head on Brad's shoulder and whispered that she had never imagined that happiness could be something so simple and at the same time so profound. Brad kissed the top of his head and agreed. He had spent so many years believing that loneliness was his natural destiny that he almost missed the opportunity to discover that some people are born to find each other, even if it takes a lifetime for it to happen. The coming winter no longer brought the fear of isolation and loneliness. On the contrary, Sarah and Brad looked forward to the long nights together, the conversations by the fire, the quiet comfort of two people who had learned that true love is not something you look for, but something you build day after day, choice after choice. On the last night of autumn, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Sarah touched her belly with an expression of wonder-surprise. Brad followed her gaze and immediately understood the miracle that was happening. The following spring would bring not only the end of winter, but new life to the valley. A child who would grow up knowing only love and protection, who would never know what it meant to be afraid of who should take care of her. Sarah smiled at Brad with a happiness that seemed to radiate its own light. He said he wanted the child to grow up there, in the mountains, where he had learned that sometimes the happiest endings begin with the most desperate beginnings. Brad hugged her, feeling that his world had expanded beyond what he ever believed possible. They had started out as two castaways, seeking shelter in the storm, and had become a family. The wind blew through the valley, carrying with it the promise that some stories, the best stories, are the ones that begin when we think it's too late to start over. And in that moment, watching the snow gently cover the land they'd learned to call home, Sarah and Brad knew they'd found something rarer than gold. They'd found each other. The cabin in the mountains would remain a refuge, but no longer a hiding place. It would be a home where love would grow like the plants in Sarah's garden, strong, resilient, and able to flourish even in the harshest conditions. And so beneath the stars of the Wild West, two lonely hearts have discovered that sometimes fate arrives disguised as desperation, bringing exactly what we need at the time we need it most, even when we don't know we're waiting. If this story of courage and survival has touched your heart, you can't miss our upcoming adventures in the American Wild West. Subscribe to the channel to follow more narratives of redemption, true love, and second chances in the wildlands of the frontier, where brave men and women find hope even in the darkest of times.